World in the Making, A Global History, Volume 2, Since 1300 by Bonnie G. Smith, Chapter 28, A New Global Age, 1989 to the Present, Part 2. Global Livelihoods and Institutions. Focus. How has globalization reshaped the global workforce and traditional political institution? The same forces that created a global market for products and services created a global market for labor factories. Moved to wherever labor was cheapest, workers around the world faced greater competition for employment as many well-paid jobs increasingly disappeared in the 21st century. At the same time, better transportation and communication led people to travel thousands of miles to find jobs. Indonesian village women, for instance, left their families to work for as domestic servants in the Middle East, and Filipino nurses went to Japan and elsewhere as healthcare providers in better paying environments. Migration, innovations in communication technology, and the globalization of business combined to create global cities. Finally, global financial, political, and activist institutions such as the World Trade Organization, the United Nations, and Doctors Without Borders operated beyond any single nation, making a global order based on relationships among individual states seemed obsolete. Doctors Without Borders. This doctor from the global NGO Doctors Without Borders distributes plastic sheetings to construct refugee shelters during the 1994 civil war and genocide in Rwanda. In an age of ethnic conflict and civil war, refugees were an all too common type of global citizen, one lacking the most basic of human rights, adequate health care. Global networks and changing jobs. The internet, in particular, advanced globalization, bringing new jobs to previously impoverished countries. One of the first to recognize the possibilities of computing and call desk services was Ireland, which attracted global businesses by stressing computer literacy. From the 1990s on, as the people of this traditionally poor country began to prosper while working for clients throughout the world, the trend reached other nations. Moroccans could do help desk work for French or Spanish speakers, and Filipinos could repair computers across the globe. 3% of Indian domestic product came from the outsourcing work it did in payroll and other services. But jobs flowed in multiple directions. In 2017, a major Indian company, Infosys, planned to send some 10,000 jobs to America. Local knowledge was becoming important to many employers' success abroad. Those who worked in outsourced jobs were more likely to participate in the global consumer economy. Thus, consumption soared in India, China, Brazil, and other emerging markets. A 21-year-old Indian woman working for a service provider in Bangalore under the English name Sharon was able to buy a cell phone from the Finnish company Nokia. With her salary as a teenager, I wished for so many things, she said. Now I'm my own Santa Claus, unquote. North Africans, Indians, and Eastern Europeans had access to automobiles and iPhones. These would have been beyond their means before the 1990s. Critics called phenomena consumania. Consumerism developed unevenly, however. Many in southern nations lacked the means for even basic purchases. Competition among lower level workers for good jobs across the globe led to low wages everywhere. How can I prepare my children for a knowledge based society when I can't even put food on the table? Unquote, one French mother objected. Those with advanced managerial, technological, and other skills derived from university education fared better, showing the increasing importance of education to prosperity. Neoliberalism added to worker impoverishment An important tenet of neoliberalism was that profit and investment increase through downsizing, that is, reducing the number of jobs and enhancing the productivity of any remaining individual workers, although Europeans still believed government should provide social services and education for all. The tightening of budgetary rules in the European Union meant that these services had to constitute a smaller part of the budget. The Swedish government drastically cut pensions, leading one union member to complain, quote, "It means that we have to work our entire life," unquote, because employers like workers paid taxes for social service programs. Reduction in benefits meant smaller employer contributions, which employers obviously favored to boost profits. Some nations believed in promoting the public good. These governments continued to run highly quality education, health, and transportation systems, and to provide well-maintained roads, for example. Beyond the nation state, supernatural organizations fostered globalization by creating worldwide networks to provide information and aid and set global standards for interactions such as trade. In the 1990s and therefore thereafter, Europeans expanded the range of their common governmental institutions, while countries of the southern cone, unquote, of South America joined the effort to achieve even greater economic and social progress through cooperation. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank grew in power by raising money from individual governments and then using it to assist developing countries in modernizing projects and in repayment of debts. The condition for such aid, however, was restructuring of the economy according to neoliberal principles. Other supernatural organizations not connected to governments and hence called non-governmental organizations, NGOs, or charitable or policy-oriented foundations. Those NGOs possessing great wealth often shaped national policies. Some NGOs, such as the France-based Doctors Without Borders, used contributions to provide medical aid in such places as the former Yugoslavia and or Afghanistan, where people at war lacked any medical help except where outsiders could provide. Globalization has also entailed the rise of global activism, even against globalization itself. Political leaders flocked to an alternative conference at Porto Alegre, Brazil in 2002 to protect people from the worst globalization effects, even as they attended the more traditionally global Davos Forum held annually in Switzerland for the world's leading officials and executives. Women activists also held global meetings such as the UN Fourth World Conference on Women held in Beijing, China, in 1995 to negotiate a common platform for political action. The event was eye-opening for many participants, especially those from industrialized countries who had thought themselves more advanced than women from Africa and South America. The reverse proved to be true. In the end, their joint declaration aimed to advance their goals of equality, development, and peace for all women everywhere in the interest of all humanity. In the 21st century, while women became heads of state in Germany, Liberia, Chile, Great Britain, Brazil, and some 20 other nations, they also held high positions in global organizations such as the United Nations and the IMF. In 1992, the 12 countries of the European Economic Community or Common Market ended national distinctions in the spheres of business activity, border controls, and transportations, with citizens of member countries carrying a common burgundy-colored passport. In 1994, by the terms of the Maastricht Treaty, the European Economic Community became the European Union, EU, and in 1999, a common currency, the European Currency Unit, the ECU or Euro, was established. The EU Parliament convened regularly in Strasbourg, France, while its central bank gained more control over region-wide economic policy. Beginning in 2004, the EU admitted 15 new members, mostly from Central and Eastern Europe, with other candidates including Turkey waiting for acceptance. See map 28.3. European Union, an expanded version of the European Economic Community established in 1994 to increase political and economic cooperation among European nations. The success of the EU prompted the creation of other cooperative zones that imitated the early common market. In 1967, 5 countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand, formed the Association of the Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, later expanded to include the Brunei Darussalam 1984, Vietnam 1995, Laos and Myanmar 1997, and Cambodia 1999. ASEAN members engaged in a range of cooperative ventures focused especially on rapid economic cooperation and expansion. The North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, implemented in 1994, eliminated nearly all tariffs on goods traded between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. Mercosur, formed in 1991, established a free trade zone among South America's southern cone. Countries Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and Paraguay, all of which were full members, and Chile and Bolivia as associates. These transnational organizations hardly matched the integration of the EU, and NAFTA explicitly rejected the kind of borderless opportunities for workers that EU allowed. Workers in the United States watched in dismay as jobs moved to fuel Mexico's industrial zones on its U.S. border. But it turned out that 5 to 6 million jobs in the United States stemmed from NAFTA agreements. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, a transnational organization formed in 1967 to facilitate economic cooperation among Southeast Asian countries. North American Free Trade Agreement, an agreement among Canada, Mexico, and the United States established in 1994 that eliminated most tariffs on goods traded among signatories. Mercosur, the establishment in 1991 of a free trade zone among nations of South America's southern cone. Here's the map for 28.3. Try and get as close as I can so that you can see this. A new global age. By the start of the 21st century, the world's people were bound together. More significantly than ever, migration brought unprecedented ethnic and cultural diversity to entire regions. While large regional alliances fostered unity, at least superficially, no less real in their impact were the mixing of cultures and the shared experience of terrorism and disease. A cluster of cities were also global powerhouses, competitive with some nations. Old urban areas, including Hong Kong, Paris, Tokyo, London, and New York, used innovations in transportation and communication to become magnets for economic activity and for migrants from all over the world. Within these cities, high-level decision makers interacted with one another to set global economic policy and to transact business worldwide. Their high pay drove up living costs and sent middle managers and engineers to live in lower priced suburbs with good schools and other amenities. For these well-educated white-collar workers living in often squalid conditions in the run-down neighborhoods of global cities were the maintenance, domestic, and other workers, sometimes called lumpentrash, unquote, who needed to be at the book and call for of global enterprise. Suburbanization and ghettoization flourished simultaneously, testifying to globalization's uneven economic and social effects. Huge numbers of willing migrants flocked to leading global cities. 2015, for example, more than 100,000 Japanese lived in England, staffing Japan's global enterprises. Located there, these migrants did not aim to become citizens, nor did they make any financial claim on the adopted country. Global cities were sometimes criticized for producing a territorialization of identities, meaning that residents of these areas lacked both a national and a local sense of themselves, so much so that they were at home anywhere in the world. Seeing the past, the globalization of urban space. Global culture. A crucial ingredient of globalization was the deepening relationship among cultures through shared books, films, and music from different traditions. Latin American authors, prominent among them Colombian-born Nobel Prize winner Gabriel Garcia Marquez, developed a style known as magical realism, which melded everyday events with elements of Latin American history, myth, magic, and religion. His lush fantasies, including 100 Years of Solitude, 1967, represented the Latin American creative boom to billions of readers worldwide and gave eager authors a style to emulate into the 21st century. Authors charted the horrors of 20th and 21st century history among this Stalinism, colonialism, and U.S. domination. Svetla Alexeyevich was a Russian journalist and writer who devoted her career to investigating women's testimonies of World War II and the sweep of Russian history under Stalin, Gorbachev, and Putin. Among others, for taking on these subjects, she passed long stretches of her life in exile, although eventually winning the Nobel Prize in Literature. The Nigerian-born writer Chimamanda Adichie depicted the complexities of living in West Africa after colonialism had spawned authoritarian governments. Her pupil, Hibiscus, 2003, featured the complicated hope that educated Africans living in dictatorships found in thinking about exile to the United States. Similarly, writing across cultures, Indian-born Amitav Ghosh presented in works like The Glass Palace 2000 and Ibis Trilogy 2008 to 2015. A global cast of characters intersecting for both good and ill in the context of global capitalism, poverty, drugs, and imperial domination. Seeing the past, the globalization of urban space. The New Louvre, Paris, France. One everyday sign of globalization is the homogenization of urban architecture. Travelers to urban capitals may see carefully preserved and distinctive buildings from centuries past that differ from one continent to another. Alongside the ancient buildings are recent ones, similar in style whether they are in Dubai, Malaysia, Japan, Brazil, or the United States. The similarity arises not only from the globalization of style, but from the globalization of architects themselves who bid and construct buildings far beyond their home countries, often in collaboration with architects from other parts of the world. The Louvre was once a royal palace. It evolved from a 12th century fortified residence of kings to a museum, not only for the French, but for the millions of international tourists. In the 1980s, the French government undertook a major renovation of the central entrance to the Louvre, which was no longer adequate to deal with the throngs of tourists. The Japanese architect I.M. Pai, who designed buildings around the world, produced this entryway through a glass pyramid. Examining the evidence, why might so ancient a structure as a pyramid have been chosen to be placed in front of the Louvre? Why might glass have been used instead of the stone from which Egyptian pyramids were constructed? What message does this update the entrance of the Louvre convey? Popular music also thrived in the global marketplace, mixing styles from all over the world. Hip-hop, rap, and salsa music, for example, combined African, Latin American, and African American traditions into new musical genres. African hip-hop artists claimed hip-hop and rap as part of an African heritage based on the poet-singers or griots, who for centuries had lyrically recited history and legends. In 1988, the South African group Black Noise, active in the anti-apartheid movement, produced the region's modern version of rap. Salsa music likewise circled the world, flourishing not just in Latin America and the Caribbean, but also in the United States as more Hispanics migrated there. African influences shaped salsa too, via the slave heritage of the Western Hemisphere. Rai, the popular music of North African cities, echoed in the Algerian suburbs of Paris, and performances by Rai stars attracted tens of thousands of fans. Dangdut, a form of popular music in Indonesia, used tunes from Bollywood film while its lyrics expressed Islamic values, the combination appealing to diasporas in the world's largest Islamic state. Chutney generally described the fusion music of the Caribbean, but particularly the influence of the many South Asian indentured workers who settled there in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Global pop culture. Inul Daratista, a sensation in Indonesia and beyond for her singing and dancing performances, blends Indian, Middle Eastern, Malay, Portuguese styles. Inul's body moves sensuously and rapidly, and Muslim clergy object to her lack of modesty. Although Inul Daratista's dangdut music originates in local folk performances, she has made global phenomena. Religion has also operated globally, but few practices of any single religion were uniform from culture to culture. While all Muslims practiced the 5 pillars of their faith, including charitable giving, they embraced a wide variety of interpretations of Islam. See Lives and Livelihoods, Readers of the Quran. In the 1990s, Turkish youth raised with the nation's Republican and secular beliefs began to follow green pop stars and to read, quote, green romances, green being the color of paradise in the Muslim faith. While enjoying gossip, jokes, and the company of their best friends, young women decided to wear headscarves and follow the call to prayer, explaining, "We pray like you have fun," unquote. Lives and Livelihoods, Readers of the Quran. Among the most popular stars in the global media are those who chant the Quran in recordings available on cassettes, CDs, radio, and cell phones. Specially trained and tested Quran reciters, literally thousands of them, make their recordings in dozens of cities in the Islamic world, Ummah. But only after being certified by official examining boards. Readers must know the Quran to perfection, because errors such as stopping in the middle of a word would mirror the holy words of Allah as handed down through the Prophet of Muhammad. Cassettes allow the Quran to inspire Muslims at home to or work. For example, a carpenter in Cairo keeps his tape playing during the day. Quote, "I have 2 ears," the carpenter reports, one for work and one for listening to the Quran. Readers of the Quran in Kazan, Russia. Despite the Soviet Union's unofficial policy of atheism, Kazan has remained a center of Islamic culture and practice. It is the site of magnificent mosques and hosts expert readings of the Quran. In this 2008 photograph of a Quran reading contest, a young expert reciter vies with others from across Russia for the best and truest performance. Although most reciters of the Quran are men, one of the best known is Mariah Ufa, a reciter from Indonesia. Taught as a child that men and women are equal, she has traveled to many parts of the world to read. Like Ufa, well-loved readers of the Quran become celebrities. In Egypt, Sheikh Mohammed Gabriel is the most appreciated. Listeners immediately recognize his voice. He is known to bring in crowds of over 500,000 when reading in public. Quote, "When I hear Sheikh Gabriel, I feel that the angels are reading with him," unquote. A retired Army officer said, despite the standardization involved in certification, the reading of the Quran and the issuing of calls to prayer 5 times a day have their variations according to region and language. Muslims in Kenya, for example, prefer the sounds to the call to prayer by their country's readers to those recorded in Egypt. Recordings by the thousands of reciters show, in fact, differences and nuances by region, again proving that even in the face of the standardization and globalization, local identities remain important to carrying out one's daily life. You can get bored by a song in a few days, a record store owner said, but one gets bored listening to the Quran. Source, Douglas Gill. Above the city's din, always the voice of Allah. New York Times International, March 6, 1996. Questions to consider. In the case of the Quran in people's lives, what has been the effect of modern communications technology? How would you describe the role of the reciter of the Quran in modern society? Is he or she a religious leader, service worker, or media personality? Over time, what has been the effect of books, television, CDs, and other media on religion generally? For further information, you can check out these websites. The promises and perils of globalization. Focus. What major benefits and dangers has globalization brought to the world's people? Despite growing prosperity, the global age has been called a world in disarray. For the first, the health of the world's peoples and their environments came under the multi-pronged attack from industrial disasters, acid rain, epidemics, and global warming. Second, a surging population, especially in southern regions, increased demands on resources and often fed strife. Migration from imperiled areas surged dramatically, and transnational religious and ethnic movements also competed, sometimes through the use of terrorism. Finally, a devastating economic crisis that broke out in 2008 ricocheted into geopolitics, leading to the rise of nationalist authoritarianism in some nations and to reassertions of democracy and global cooperation in others. Environmental changes. In the early 21st century, people continue to worry about the impact of technological development on the environment. In 1984, poisonous gas leaking from the Union Carbide plant in Bhopal, India, had killed an estimated 10 to 15,000 people, harmed tens of thousands permanently, and left the region completely contaminated by chemicals. In 1986, an explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in present-day Ukraine killed 30 people instantly and left many more to die from radiation. Clearing the world's rainforest, depleting the global oxygen supply, and threatened the biological diversity of the entire planet. See map 28.4. And then here's a close-up of the map. Map 28.4, the global environment of the early 21st century. As industry advanced and population grew, the earth itself came under assault. Degradation of the environment, including desertification, the transformation of formerly agrarian land into desert, depletion of rainforests, climate extremes, industrial catastrophes, and other changes caused by humans threaten to sustain the sustainability of life. By the late 1980s, scientists determined that the use of chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, chemicals found in the aerosols and refrigeration products, had blown a hole in the Earth's ozone layer, the part of the blanket of atmospheric gases that prevents harmful ultraviolet rays from reaching the planet. The buildup of CFCs, carbon dioxide produced by burning of fossil fuels and other atmospheric pollutants, produced a greenhouse effect that resulted in global warming. By 2017, global warming had produced weather extremes such as more frequent and stronger hurricanes and droughts, and the breakup of the Arctic ice pack, as measurable through space technology. Global warming and increase in the temperature of the Earth's lower atmosphere, resulting in dramatic weather cycles and melting of glaciers. Activism over decades against unbridled industrial growth led in 1979 to the founding of the Green Party in West Germany, followed by Green Party development worldwide. Nation building, however, led politicians to push big and questionable projects such as dams. Egypt's Aswan Dam was built in the 1960s, and China's Three Gorges Dam, constructed between 1994 and 2015, destroyed miles of villages and farmland and cost thousands of lives, even as it produced massive hydroelectric power. Chinese Nobel laureate Jiao Jingjian explored questions about ecological disaster as he described peasant reactions to the destruction that and invoked the responsibilities of human community for the earth's well-being. In his novel Soul Mountain 2000, Jiao was denounced by modernizers around the world and punished more than once in China, leading to his self-imposed exile, during which he gathered stories for his novel. The Arctic Pack. Arctic sea ice was more than 25% smaller in 2011 than its average extent during the period 1979 to 2000. Whereas the Arctic ice pack once virtually closed shipping, by the early 21st century, some ships could navigate the waters around it for an extended period. Scientists saw coastal cities around the world and marine life threatened. People attacked environmental problems in both the local and global levels. Beginning in 1977, Wangari Maathai enlisted women to plant trees to create green belts around Kenya's capital city of Nairobi. Born in Kenya, Madai had studied botany in the United States and veterinary medicine in Africa. Local deforestation led her to create a citizens movement. Quote, "It's important for people to see that they are part of the environment and that they take responsibility for it," unquote. She explained powerful politicians and business people had her beaten up and run out of the country. In 2004, Madai won the Nobel Peace Prize for her efforts to improve the environment and livelihoods of Africans. Frankfurt, Germany, and other European cities developed car-free zones. The Smart, a very small car using reduced amounts of fuel, became a popular way for Europeans to cut their use of fossil fuels. Cities also developed bicycle lanes on major streets. Germany, Spain, the United States, Denmark, and China had some 80% of the world's wind installations to generate electricity in 2005. In 2016, the Paris Climate Agreement went into effect by 2017 had 195 signatories, with the United States the second worst global polluter after China, withdrawing from the plan to reduce dangers to the environment. Population pressures and public health. Nations with less developed economies struggled with rapidly rising populations, and life expectancy globally rose by an average of 16 years between 1950 and 1980. Censuses in 2015 showed Eastern Europe and Japan actually experiencing negative growth, that is, more deaths than births. Less industrially developed countries accounted for 98% of worldwide population growth, thanks to medicine increasing the lifespan of people there. By 2015, the Earth's population had reached 7.3 billion, and by 2050 was projected to reach 9.8 billion. Non-Western governments were alarmed at their nation's rising population and took action. In 1979, Deng introduced the one-child policies for urban Chinese families, which was not lifted until 2015. By the 1990s, the Iranian government was urging families to space their children. The birth rate fell from 6.5 live births per Iranian woman in the 1970s to below 2 in 2010. For a time in the 1970s, the Indian government used a policy of forced sterilization. Mullahs in Afghanistan also studied population. Quote, if you have too many children and you can't control them, unquote. One reported after a class on birth control, that's bad for Islam, unquote. Vaccines and drugs for disease such as malaria and smallpox helped improve health in developing nations. However, half of all Africans lacked access to basic public health facilities such as safe drinking water. In the early 1980s, medical expertise was further challenged by a global epidemic disease, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, AIDS, caused by human immunodeficiency virus, HIV. The government of Vietnam launched a dramatic poster campaign. Quote, do not use or accept harmful cultural products. Do not become addicted to smoking or injecting drugs, unquote. In fact, the major culprits for the spread of AIDS in Vietnam were privileged and sexually adventurous public officials. By 2010, no cure had been discovered, though scientists developed strong drugs that alleviated the symptoms. Activists protested that these costly drugs existed, but only white victims were being saved. Alongside AIDS, the deadly Ebola virus, bird flu, swine flu, and dozens of other viruses harbored the potential for global pandemics. Interconnectedness via diseases and scientific advances gained from combating them showed both the perils and promises of globalization. Worldwide migration. The 21st century witnessed accelerating migration worldwide, building in the migration that followed decolonization and often adding to the diversity of many regions of the world. See again map 28.3. An estimated 190 million rural Chinese traveled to China's industrial cities to find work in 2004, while millions more went to Malaysia, Indonesia, and other regions in Southeast Asia to get jobs. Sometimes danger prompted migration. Africans fled civil wars in Rwanda, Congo, and Sudan, often heading for Europe, Canada, and the United States, or to nearby South Africa. Civil wars and ethnic oppression drove civilians from states of the former Soviet Union and its satellites to Germany, Scandinavia, Austria, France, and England. Jordan and other countries of the Middle East and Europe were home to Palestinians, Iraqis, and Syrians, all driven from their homelands by violence. A particularly apparent form of coerced migration was the increasing trafficking in children and women for sexual and other kinds of forced labor. The conditions of migration varied depending on one's class, gender, and regional origin. Among the most fortunate migrants were professionals in science and technology. Less fortunate were women from the Philippines, Indonesia, and other southern regions who migrated to perform domestic service. They frequently suffered rape by their employers, oppressive working conditions, and confiscation of their wages. Men and women alike traveled into Europe Union or the United States, packed into airless storage containers and trucks or on unsafe boats to find opportunity or to escape political turmoil. By 2015, millions of distressed migrants from violent regions were receiving a hostile, even brutal reception. Ironically, given the country's history of innovation by immigrants, U.S. politics increasingly centered on the presence of illegal aliens. Malaysian politicians blamed a Chinese in their midst for problems of modernization, whereas Indonesians rampaged against both Chinese and Christian authoritarian politicians and would-be dictators worldwide won support by promising to fix the immigrant problem, unquote. Migration stories, many of them bestsellers, related to would-be migrants' dream of magnetic order worlds, conjured up amid oppressive conditions. Expatriate Russian author Andrei Makin who immigrated to France, produced lyrical accounts of Siberian people's powerful imaginings of a better world in Once Upon a River Love, 1998. Reading Lolita in Tehran, 2003, a memoir by Iranian author Azar Nafisa, an immigrant to the United States, and Belzak and the Little Chinese Seamstress, 2003, by Dai Siji, a Chinese refugee in Europe, detail the powerful influence of Western literature under conditions of repression. Nafisi, who left her post at Tehran University during the Iranian theocracy, writes of bringing a group of young women to her home to read forbidden books. The two young men in Siji's novel are banished to the countryside during China's Cultural Revolution and discover there a supply of 19th century Western classics. Terrorism confronts the world. Even as literature portrayed diverse global relationships, the world's people also experience interconnectedness as terrifying. In the 1970s, European terrorist bands, such as Italy's Red Brigades, responded to post 1968 politics with kidnappings, bank robberies, bombings, and assassinations. In 1972, Palestinian terrorists kidnapped and murdered 11 Israeli athletes at the Olympic Games in Munich. After Bloody Sunday, January 30th, 1972, in Northern Ireland, when British troops fired on unarmed civil rights demonstrator, a cycle of violence ensued that left thousands dead. Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was assassinated by her Sikh security guards in 1984 after the Indian government attacked a Sikh temple. Tamil separatists from Sri Lanka assassinated Indira Gandhi's son, Rajiv, for his lack of support. In 1991, anti government U.S. terrorists blew up a federal building in Oklahoma City in 1995. In the same year, Japanese religious radicals released deadly poisonous gas in the Tokyo subway system to promote their beliefs. 2011, Norwegian fundamentalist Christian and anti Muslim extremists massacred close to 80 young political activists and wounded hundreds more. Terrorists from the Middle East and North Africa planted bombs in many European cities, blew up European airplanes, and bombed the Paris subway system. Among other acts from the 1980s into the 21st century, some attacks were said to be punishment for the West's support for both Israel and repressive regimes in the Middle East. On September 11, 2001, Middle Eastern militants hijacked 4 planes in the United States and flew 2 of them into the World Trade Center in New York and one into the Pentagon in Virginia. The 4th plane crashed in Pennsylvania. The hijackers, most of whom were from Saudi Arabia, were inspired by Osama bin Laden, the charismatic founder of the Al-Qaeda transnational terrorist organization who was supported by the United States during the Cold War, but now wanted U.S. military forces removed from Saudi Arabia. The loss of some 3,000 lives led to the United States to declare war on terrorism, unquote. Global Corporation followed on September 11th attacks and the continuing lethal bombings around the world from Bali to Britain. See again, map 28.3. European countries rounded up terrorists and conducted the first successful trials of them in the spring of 2003. Ultimately, Western Corporation fragmented when the United States invaded Iraq in March of 2003, claiming falsely that Iraq's Saddam Hussein's had weapons of mass destruction. In 2011, American forces scored a symbolic victory on the war on terror, unquote, through the capital and execution of Osama bin Laden. As the invasion of Iraq fragmented civic unity, a new transnational terrorist group, the Islamic State, or ISIS or ISIL, became operational and thrived in the country. Alongside the many promises of globalization was the incredible toll in lives taken by terrorism and the worldwide xenophobia or hatred of foreigners that followed. Even as terrorism continued, a new manifestation of anti government sentiment appeared that brought hope across the Middle East. In late 2010 and 2011, an Arab Spring began in a series of popular uprisings, some of which forced dictators in North Africa and the Middle East to step down or to reform government. Uprisings in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya succeeded, even in the face of brutal repression. In Egypt, longtime dictator Hosni Mubarak surrendered power and was tried for the murder of many protesters. Hard on the heels of the Egyptian success, protests mounted against dictators in Libya and Syria, with NATO planes helping with the Libyan rebels defeat Muammar Gaddafi. Arab Spring of 2010 to 2011. I'm going to try and get as close as I can on that. There you go. In the place of these dictators, tribal organizations, along an alternative political form to the nation state, sometimes came to control decision making, and in Syria, rebel forces confronted the dictator Bashar al Assad in what became a deadly civil war. Still, the sophisticated means by which protesters had mobilized, including the use of email and social networking to create meeting points and devise strategies, seemed hopeful. The promise of the Arab Spring was not just in its accomplishments, but in the virtual societies young and older citizens had constructed through technology. Yet these same techniques benefited the highly violent Islamic State, which only added to death and destruction in the Middle East. Youth worldwide, often facing unemployment due to globalization and restructuring, served as the shock troops, first of Al Qaeda and then of ISIS, in escalating global terrorism in the second decade of the 21st century. Here's the second map. I'll try to get as close as I can on that so you can kind of look at that. Map 28.5, Wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, 2001-2011. After the terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001, the U.S. government, with help of Western Afghani allies, launched an attack on the Taliban, a group in control of Afghanistan and a supporter of Al Qaeda. In 2003, the United States and its allies invaded Iraq on the grounds that it had weapons of mass destruction, which was not true. Global economic crisis and the rise of authoritarian politicians. As the 21st century opened, the global economy suffered a series of shocks, including terrorism and civil war. In 1997, many East Asian economies faced collapse after a period of rapid growth, but also rapid indebtedness, as hot money, unquote, in the form of investment loans flowed into these so-called Pacific Tigers. The decline in the value of their currencies made it difficult to repay. The International Monetary Fund helped bail them out, but the region's economies faltered badly. Their fragile recovery was followed by the bursting 2008 of a real estate bubble in the United States. Housing prices had escalated because of mortgage financing available on easy or even dishonest terms. Then financiers distributed this often fraudulent debt around the world to those who helped to make handsome profits because adjustable mortgage rates were set to rise dramatically. When people became unable to repay their mortgage and credit card debt, credit became unavailable both to ordinary people and to banks and industry. A credit collapse followed, just as it had in the stock market collapse of 1929. Governments around the world tried to save banks and industries with the infusion of billions of dollars. Unemployment rose as businesses and consumers alike stopped purchasing goods. In 2011, some European Some European governments faced possible bankruptcy, especially as the price of commodities plunged. The globalization of economic crisis haunted the world's population even as recovery was at hand by 2017. As in the past, hard times encouraged the rise of authoritarian figures with quick and easy solutions. In Europe, which faced the influx of millions of refugees from Iraq, Syria, and other threatened regions, this issue, when combined with economic difficulties, benefited strongmen, pounding the idea that migration and globalization, not technological innovation and dishonest businesses, caused the crash. Politicians employed the techniques of divisive divisiveness and social pessimism that had been the stock in trade of 20th century dictators. Whereas enemies then had been Jews, gays, and Roma, people now were set against migrants within their borders or competitors on the global stage. Hungary, Poland, Russia, Czechoslovakia, Italy, and the United States saw the appeal to hatred for migrating peoples weaken the politics of consensus building and freedom of speech. Ironically, globalization helped these anti globalization politicians, a social network meddling by Russia, sowed the divisiveness that authoritarian politicians claim to be the result of democratic politics. Almost uniformly, the disappearance of jobs due to the technological innovation was cast as due instead to evil foreigners and nations. People in Europe and the United States turned against multilateral global alliances such as the European Union, NAFTA, and the Trans Pacific Partnership, and in some cases, even against their fellow citizens. Women's march inside the Kura forest in Kenya's capital, Nairobi. Women across the globe had been organizing mass meetings and protests locally, nationally, and internationally for more than a century. On January 21st, 2017, demonstrations occurred worldwide to mark women's disagreement with what they believed were President Donald Trump's beliefs, agenda, and behavior. In particular, toward women, Kenya's women came out in force to show solidarity. Counterpoint: defending local identity in a globalization world. Focus: how have peoples worked to maintain distinctive local identities in today's global age? Amid globalization, individuals sought to reclaim local, personal, and even national identities. The advance of globalization produced both a sense of loss and a feeling that something other than global forces and even nation states was needed to provide values and well-being. People sought various ways to proclaim their personal identities through local religious customs or by reviving age-old traditions of dress, food, and celebration, or by showing loyalty to local sports teams, despite the fact that most teams were allied with global businesses, including television networks and marketers of consumer goods. In some countries, such as the United States, Hungary, and Poland, populist politicians promised a return to past prosperity and so called racial order. Ethnic strife and political splintering. One counter to globalization aimed to creating and empowering smaller political units, such groups as the Tamils in Sri Lanka and Sikhs in India struggled unsuccessfully for autonomy for their people from the homogenizing nation state. The wealthy Catalonian region of Spain also sought to become an independent nation. By 2010, there were more nations than there were at the end of the World War II in 1945 because people divided some countries according to ethnicity. Since 1990, some 29 new nations have been born, including South Sudan in 2011, the post-communist emergence of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Serbia, and other Eastern European states, often involved bitter civil wars among ethnic groups and the forcible ejection or genocide of minority groups. Many a politician found the case the cause of the secession a row to public office. For example, a number of those working to separate Scotland from Great Britain and Great Britain itself from the European Union. The latter movement, dubbed Brexit, was a successful campaign to restore the greatness of the nation in the face of absorption in a transnational cooperative, the EU. The Russian use of social media to sow division in other nations aimed to make Russia appear larger in the global stage as the European Union fragmented and as individual societies became more dysfunctional. Movements to protect tradition. The desire to maintain a local identity also encompassed movements to preserve local customs and practices, including some of the world's thousands of languages, which were under threat of being swallowed by Chinese, Hindi, Spanish, and English. In January 2005, Guatemalan forces killed a Maya Cachical man who sought to block a global mining firm's inroads into his community. At issue in hundreds of similar protests was the preservation of local customs, a livelihood, and traditional rights. In late 1993, a group of activists in the Chiapas state of Mexico declared themselves a local liberation army devoted to stanching the quote bleeding of their locality by stopping the flow of oil, coffee, bananas, and other resources out of the area and onto the world market, leaving the local people destitute. These activists, known as Zapatistas, recalling the name of the hero in the 1910 revolution, also decried the ridicule heaped on their way of life by globalizers. The Nimbiquara of Brazil. Here's a close-up of these pictures. The Nambika-Wara, described in the preface to this book, have themselves struggled to preserve their way of life from those bringing in modern technology, farming, logging, scholarly, and missionary activity. Although preserving their way of life and untouched by modernity, in fact, the Nambikawara are constantly being photographed, studied, and reorganized by these outside forces. Some subgroups of the Nambikwara were become extinct, especially because of imported diseases. But these healthy youngsters are carrying on the Nimbikwara contribution to world making. In seeking to preserve their local Mayan identity, the activists were similarly to the pilgrims, excuse me, in Vietnam who brought fruit to special shrines around Hanoi to be blessed by local gods. The rap groups Plastis in Tanzania promoted the wearing of traditional garb to fight the globalization of clothing that threatened to erase their local culture. South American indigenous women also organized in 2009 to preserve their traditional values. As we women are part of nature and the universe, we are called to care for and defend our Mother Earth. From her comes the ancient history and culture that makes us what we are, unquote. The Nambikawara of Brazil, with whom this book began, although losing their variety of inherited languages and many of them their diverse peoples, continue to pursue their centuries old way of life, even though surrounded by, quote, modernizing forces. Finally, rural people left behind by a globalization steamroller joined anti urban populist political movements that promised to restore the well paying local jobs lost to the global market. Yet another facet of making the world. Conclusion. Sometimes I tell myself I may only be planting a tree here, but just imagine what's happening if there are billions of people out there doing something. Just imagine the power of what we can do, unquote. Wangari Maathai's motivation reflected a belief that billions of citizens acting locally as individuals could affect change in a global scale as part of a worldwide effort. Innovations in communications, transportation, and the development of strong transnational organizations have accelerated at the pace of globalization in the past 4 decades. Globalization is evident everywhere in the worldwide spread of disease, worldwide migration, and the worldwide consequences of industrialization. It is seen in those spread of campaigns like Nelson Mandela's on behalf of human rights and in dastardly acts of global terrorism as the world's people come to work on common projects and share elements of one another's culture. Their mental outlook has become more global, more cosmopolitan. The Chinese painter Wu Gongzong, even after years of repression for his cosmopolitan style, combined elements from around the world in his work. In my art, unquote, Wu said, I really belong to the hybridized breed, unquote. Many rightly protest that much of value can be lost at the hands of global forces or in authoritarian populism at work in the world today. Others foresee some great irreconcilable clash among civilizations. The question remains whether, given human interaction in a globalizing world, we are not all hybrids. That is, mixtures of one another's thoughts, traditions, cultures, and livelihoods as we engage in making and remaking the world. Isn't this mixture of the world's peoples what has given texture to the recent world? Review the major global development in this chapter that causes the causes and consequences of intensified globalization. Here's the dates. You'll probably want to pause the video and key terms. And this is the end of chapter 28. Thank you.